Greetings and solutions, fellow Yankee Museum members and guests. Is this working tonight? Hello. We'll make sure it does. Most of the time, it don't want me to use it anyway. So, I want to welcome you, everyone, tonight to the November edition of Historic Presentation Night at Yankee Air Museum. For those in attendance who are not Yankee members, this event is free for members and just one of the many benefits that you get with a Yankee membership. How many non-members do we have? Oh, cool. Becca, right quickly. Don't let them out until. Okay. However, even for members, you do get in free, but we do ask for donations at the end of the evening so we can continue to bring these great programs to you every month. We got a box here on the table. We got one just outside the door. $5 from each member will go a long way to helping us defer the costs on these programs. As far as upcoming events, I can announce that Wings and Wheels will be June 9th and 10th this year at our new hangar. That way. That way.
That way. There you go. I'm
great in an airplane, but don't put me in a closed room, you know. Plus the 25th Thunder over Michigan will be August 2nd or 12th and 13th. 2nd and 13th will be a long air show. Yeah. 12th and 13th. And as always, please check the website www.yankeeairmuseum.org for upcoming events. And now we'd like to ask that you all turn your cell phones to stun or off. And hold your questions until the Q&A session at the end. After the talk, we will adjourn to the museum for book sales and signing. It looks like a very interesting book, doesn't it? Tonight we welcome Pulitzer Prize winning Ms. Beverly Weintraub, who will present Wings of Gold, the story of the first women naval aviators. This is a story of a group of 6 women selected for naval flight training in 1972 who, off the record, were expected to fail, yet succeeded far beyond expectations. Please join me in welcoming Beverly Weintraub.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much for having me and for coming out tonight to hear the story of 6 amazing women whose stories should be known and pretty much have been forgotten. And it's been an honor to have been given the opportunity to bring them back into the fore.
Can you move the microphone? Yeah, move the microphone closer to your mouth.
Okay, can we up the...
Stand up taller.
That's not going to happen. I wish. Okay, is this better?
This one, yeah. There you go.
Okay, so my name is Bev Weintraub. I'm a journalist and a pilot. I won a Pulitzer for a series of editorials when I was working at the New York Daily News. I now work at the 74, which is an education, K-12 education news website. And I've also written op-eds about women and aviation for the Daily News and the Washington Post, which is how I came to write this book. And it's especially timely now for 2 reasons. First is that next year marks 50 years of women in naval aviation. And the women in the book, who were the first women officially brought into military flight training in the United States, were those Navy pioneers. And the second reason is the Top Gun movie. Because in the original Top Gun movie, if you remember, there's a card at the very start, and it says, only the best men get to go to Top Gun. Well, the new one says, only the best men and women get to go, but they didn't just open the door and say, hey, ladies, come on. They had to fight for it. And this is the beginning of that story of how they fought for that opportunity. It didn't just happen. So the story begins, my part of the story begins in January 2019. Retired Navy Captain Rosemary Mariner passed away of ovarian cancer. She was the first woman to fly a tactical jet, first to command an aviation squadron, and an inspiring leader in promoting equal opportunity for women in the military. At her funeral, the Navy did the first ever all-woman missing man flyover. And that tribute made national news. So I got an email from a friend at the Washington Post, hey, would you write something about women in airplanes? And I wrote something. And a couple of months later, I got an email from an editor at Lyons Press who had seen the op-ed and said, "We think this might make for an interesting book. What do you think?" So it kind of doesn't really happen that a publisher comes to an author and says, "Would you write a book?" So the story really found me, and I couldn't say no. Captain Mariner was one of 6 women who were the first to win Navy Wings of Gold in this experimental program that started in 1973. They were the subjects of tremendous publicity at the start of their careers and with every milestone. And in just a minute, you'll see part of a promotional film from 1974 titled Ladies Wear the Blue. It was a half-hour pitch to recruit women into the Navy, and the very last part of it highlighted the brand new flight training program. So you will see a bit of their training regimen and footage of the first solo by a woman of a Navy aircraft. Now, unfortunately, as with some of the other source material in the book, the only prints of this film from the National Archives are in terrible condition, so I apologize in advance for the poor video and sound quality. Can we play the video?
Is it this one?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay.
Without doubt, the Navy's most ambitious plans for women have been in the flight training program. 6 young women have been selected to pave the way for future women in naval aviation. They are expected to perform the same as men. They go through the same classes, same drills, same exercises, and they fly the same planes. On May 10, 1973, Lieutenant Judith Ann Newper became the first woman to solo in a Navy aircraft when she took off in a T-34 from the Naval Air Station, Saukey Field, Florida.
It was a very good feeling to know that I had actually taken that plane off and brought it back home all on my own. It was definitely a feeling of satisfaction, the feeling of having gotten over one hurdle. And I think it helped to sort of build a little confidence too, that we are in the program, we can fly the plane, and we are able to cope with the pressures and the rigorous training that we're involved in.
Our Navy's strength lies in the fact that individuals are given the chance to show what they can do. Black or white, male or female, the opportunity is there.
Okay, so this is the book, Wings of Gold, the true story of 6 remarkable women recruited into that experimental program in 1972. Against the backdrop of the women's movement and protests against the Vietnam War, a maverick chief of naval operations decided it was time that women should train to fly Navy aircraft. They weren't expected to succeed, and they were certainly not expected to make their careers in the military. But from the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment and the end of the military draft to Tailhook, the Iraq War, and the battle to overturn a ban on women in combat, the original female naval aviators bore witness to history and made history of their own. They broke down barriers and opened doors for generations of women wanting to serve their country, and many of the challenges they faced are still very much in the headlines today. It's also a story of how difficult it is to turn a big ship like the Navy or make changes in any large organization. The women were thrown in basically cold, unprepared for what would be asked of them, and many Navy men wanted them to fail. But there were also men who saw women as an untapped pool of talent deserving of the same opportunities, starting with this gentleman. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt was the youngest Rear Admiral and the youngest Chief of Naval Operations in history. When he was named CNO in 1970, he had a crisis on his hands. In a country rocked by the civil rights movement, the youth counterculture, and the sexual revolution, traditional norms in civilian society were giving way, but the Navy remained hidebound and rigid, and it was losing recruits in droves. The re-enlistment rate, which was normally about 35%, was down to 9.5. Zumwalt had to change how the Navy did business, and his method were what were known as Z-grams, Z like Zumwalt, 121 messages from the top of the chain of command directly to the fleet. One of the first, had as its goal restoring the fun and zest of going to sea. There were Z-Grams relaxing bans on civilian clothing, raising the check cashing ceiling, allowing alcohol in some barracks, deciding whether Navy personnel were allowed to ride motorcycles, and dealing with what Zumwalt called demeaning and abrasive regulations, or in Navy speak, Mickey Mouse or chicken shit regs. Z-Grams prohibited punishing men for growing beards or sideburns, and they called out racial discrimination that put non-European Navy personnel in dead-end billets to keep them from attaining high rank, barred them from Navy housing, and made harassment, disrespect, violence, and liberal use of the N-word a regular occurrence. In August 1972, Zumwalt released Z-Gram 116, titled Equal Rights and Opportunities for Women in the Navy, not only because he believed equal opportunity was a good thing, but because it was also a potential solution to a serious personnel problem. With the Vietnam War winding down, the Navy could no longer count on men choosing to go to sea rather than being drafted to fight in the jungle. The impending end of the draft meant the Navy would have to find a way to attract volunteers. And with the expected passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, it seemed it would soon be unconstitutional to forbid women from serving on ships, limit them to desk jobs, restrict their promotions, or bar women from most positions of command, including any job that made a woman a commanding officer over men. Z-116 could give the Navy an untapped pool of talent, prepare itself for the ERA, and begin meeting new demands of women who wanted more than just traditional careers like secretary, teacher, or librarian. One of its primary goals was assigning qualified women to the full spectrum of challenging billets. And 2 months later, Navy Secretary John Warner announced that one of those challenging billets, flight training, would open to women. The idea was to find 8 female officers or officer trainees and send them through Navy flight training in Pensacola, Florida, along with male student pilots. It was really just an experiment to see what would happen. There was no plan for how the women would manage in their first billets after flight training, or what would happen if, heaven forbid, they wanted a second billet after that one. The Navy would suspend the program after 6 months, reevaluate, and decide whether it would continue or if they would pull the plug. If the women washed out, it would be the end of women pilots in the Navy for who knew how long. And if they didn't, the women were committed to serving for 4.5 years, the only female pilots in a sea of men. Because they were split up into different squadrons almost from the start, they rarely saw one another. They were truly alone. Of the 26 who applied, just 4 could pass the basic test, called the AQT, Aviation Qualification Test, with a decent FAR, Flight Aptitude Rating. They had to have 20/20 vision without glasses, pass an IQ test, have clean personal, psychological, and medical histories, and demonstrate good hand-eye coordination. There were tests of mechanical reasoning, so if a picture showed a flywheel turning one way, which way was the other flywheel going to turn? And of spatial perception, so if the horizon in the picture is tilted, which way is the airplane banking? Now, these were the kinds of skills that in the 1960s boys might learn working with tools in their dad's workshops or in shop class, but not a lot of girls had that kind of exposure. Only 4 women qualified. 3 commissioned officers working in desk jobs, and 1 trainee at Women's Officers School at Newport, Rhode Island. So the Navy asked recruiters to find some civilians who'd want to join up, and they found 4 more, and 1 from each group dropped out. So in the end, the Navy ended up with 6 women who would make military history. All but 1 came from military families. 2 already had pilot's licenses when they signed on, and 2 others had extensive flying experience. Only 1 had never flown before other than as a passenger. Like their heroines, the WASP, the Women Air Force Service pilots who flew for the Army during World War II, they opened doors for generations of female pilots who wanted to fly for their country, and their personal stories reflected changes in both the military and in the country at large. They would become the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft, as you saw, first to fly a tactical jet, first to command an aviation squadron, first female hurricane hunter, first pregnant military pilot, plaintiff in a federal class action lawsuit challenging the long-standing ban on women in combat, and tragically the first to die in the performance of her duties. Now before I introduce these women, 2 notes. They're often referred to as a class, but this was not accurate at all. They started and ended their training in different times, and they were never all in the same place at the same time. The other thing is that I refer to them by their first names in the book and in this presentation, which doesn't really sit right with me. But they had different last names at different points in their careers, and I tried writing it that way, and it got really confusing. So I asked around, and the consensus among the women and their families was that it would not be disrespectful at all to do that, and I do refer to some of the men by their first names as well. So here are these 6 women. Barbara Allen Ramey was born at Bethesda Naval Hospital, grew up in California, and was an outstanding high school and college athlete. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in physical education, she joined the Navy Reserve, was commissioned as an ensign in December 1970, and promoted to lieutenant in March 1972. Now, at the time, there were few career options for Navy women outside the medical field, and Barb didn't have a nursing degree, so she was limited to working in administration or communications. So when she heard about Warner's announcement, while she was serving as a communications watch officer with the Supreme Allied Command Atlantic, she jumped at the chance. 2 years later, retired Navy Commander Bill Allen pinned wings of gold on his daughter, the United States' first female naval aviator, at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas. Barb flew the C-1 Trader and the T-39 Saberliner, and was one of the first women to be part of a 2-pilot family trying to figure out how to navigate competing Navy careers. Sadly, she was killed in a crash in 1982 while working as a flight instructor at Middleton Field in Alabama. She's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. This is her official portrait, painted after she won her Wings of Gold. It's in the collection at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Judith Newford Bruner, the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft, as you saw, grew up around aviation. Her father flew in the Army Air Corps during World War II and managed a small airport in Ohio. Judy spent her summers answering the phone, doing odd jobs, and flying with her dad in his Piper Cub. Once during high school, an airline pilot came for career day and told her she might be a stewardess someday, but never a pilot, even though she was the only other person in the room who had ever flown. She soloed when she was 16, but aviation was expensive, and as a Star Trek fan, she wanted to become a scientist, work for NASA, and find life in outer space. But after struggling to afford college, Judy was ready to listen when an Army recruiter came to campus and offered to pay for her senior year if she enlisted. She wasn't interested in the Army, so she asked a Navy recruiter if he could match that deal, and he couldn't. But the program sounded interesting anyway, so she signed up. She spent the summer between junior and senior years at Women's Officer School in Newport, and in June 1970, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in computer science in the morning and took her oath as an ensign in the afternoon. She was working as a computer programmer in San Diego when word went out about flight training, and it reawakened her interest in aviation. On January 10, 1973, in a grand ceremony at the Pentagon, John Warner himself signed the training orders authorizing Lieutenant Judith Newford as the first woman officially signed to U.S. military flight training. And because of that, the Star Trek fan from small town Ohio got to see the world as well as the literal eye of the storm, flying the P-3 Orion as the nation's first female hurricane hunter. Later, she would fulfill her childhood dream by joining NASA, and in 2014, she received the Catherine Wright Memorial Trophy from the National Aeronautic Association for over 40 years of distinguished and historic contributions to aviation. Jane Skiles O'Day was the daughter of a naval aviator and a Navy Reserve Supply Corps officer who both served in World War II. Her dad gave her her first flight in a Ford Trimotor, and they often flew together in the Beechcraft Bonanza. But when she was in high school and applied to work the ramp at the airport where he kept his plane, the answer was no. Receptionist was the only job open to a girl. Jane graduated with degrees in political science and music and considered law school, but then a friend of her dad's told her the Navy was considering opening flight training to women, so she saw a recruiter and signed up. She was in the middle of officer candidate training in Newport when it became official, and she applied. The commander cautioned her to be careful, saying the Navy does not reward pioneers. But it was a chance to follow in her dad's footsteps, and if it didn't work out, she'd be able to go to law school on the GI Bill. Her mom was behind her 100%, and her dad was skeptical. But when Jane was winged in April 1974, her proud father, Paul, pinned his own wings of gold on his daughter. It was the first time she'd ever seen him wear his Navy blues. Lieutenant Jane Skiles O'Day would become the first woman to fly the C-130 Hercules and the first Navy female flight instructor. Also, one of the first female naval aviators to achieve command and to make captain, the first to serve overseas, and the first ever military pilot mom. Joellen Drag Oslin wanted to be a professional horse show jumper. Growing up at a time when women were not expected to be physically fit and girls' sports were pretty much non-existent, she rode horses and taught swimming, horseback riding, and skiing. She had no background in aviation, and no one in her family flew. But after she graduated college in December 1972 with a political science degree, her boyfriend in the reserve showed her a notice about Warner's announcement. At first, the recruiter didn't believe the Navy wanted women to fly. But when she went back the next day, she passed the tests and was in. On the same day Judy Newford became the Navy's first female flight cadet, retired Commander Theodore Drag administered the oath of enlistment to his daughter at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. Joellen was the first civilian student naval aviator recruit and would become the first female helicopter pilot. She decorated her flight helmet with flowers. The Navy, she said, didn't quite know what to make of us anyway. She wasn't the only one. This is Janie O'Day's flight helmet at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. After finding she was not allowed to land on ships with the rest of her squadron, Lieutenant Joellen Drag joined a class action lawsuit challenging limits on women's ability to serve. And she was mentioned by name in a ruling by a federal judge. She later became the first female pilot assigned aboard a Navy ship, the first female combat search and rescue helicopter aircraft. And later, after retiring as a captain, she and her husband, Captain Dwayne Oslin, became strong advocates for military women. As a side note, they made a little bit of history of their own when she became the first naval aviator to be guided in for a shipboard landing by a landing signal officer who happened to be her husband. Anna Maria Scott was the only one of the six not from a military family. She discovered aviation as a teenager when her boyfriend and a pilot friend took her on a night flight around San Francisco. She asked her parents for flying lessons and earned both her private pilot certificate and a political science degree while at college in California. Being fluent in Spanish, she considered the diplomatic corps, but then her dad told her he'd seen an article about the Navy looking for women to fly. She found a recruiter, signed on a month after Warner's announcement, and reported to Women's Officer School with the other civilian candidates in January 1973. Slightly more than a year later, Ensign Anna Maria Scott won her Wings of Gold. She became the Navy's second female helicopter pilot, flew VIPs all over the East Coast, and secretly made some history of her own before leaving the military and flying all over the world as a pilot for FedEx. Rosemary Bryant Mariner was the last of the six to earn her Wings of Gold and perhaps the most driven, the most outspoken, and as a friend put it, the most determined to kick open doors, put in a doorstop, and tell others to go through. She was also the only one clearly focused on aviation as a career. Rosemary was the daughter of a World War II Navy nurse and an Air Force captain who died in a crash near Atlanta when she was 3. 5 years later, her mother moved the family to the San Diego area, and one of Rosemary's favorite pastimes when babysitting her sisters was to bring them to watch jets take off and land at Naval Air Station Miramar. By 9th grade, she decided she was going to be an airline pilot, though there were no female airline pilots at the time. So she cleaned houses and washed airplanes to pay for flying lessons and got her private pilot certificate at 17 while still in high school in 1970, the year Barb was commissioned. She enrolled at Purdue University, where Amelia Earhart had once been an in-house expert on women in aviation, and she was the only woman among 20 or so guys in the professional pilot program. When she was a junior, a TWA executive came to campus and told her women would never fly for the airlines, but not long after that, Rosemary's mother mailed her a news clipping about Warner's announcement. She found a recruiter who said she could make the cut if she graduated by January 1973, so she scrambled to finish her degree in just 2.5 years. She tested out of her remaining classes, aided by professors and administrators, and earned her bachelor's degree a week before the deadline. She was the first woman to graduate from Purdue's Aviation Technology Department, with 620 hours in her logbook and certificates up to and including multi-engine instrument flight instructor. 2 weeks later, she was on her way to Women's Officer School amid a storm of publicity about the new prospective Navy female flyers. Johnny Carson, for one, talked about her by name on The Tonight Show. She was 19. It was the first step in the trailblazing career of a naval officer who was a groundbreaking Navy jet pilot, an inspiring military commander, a determined and dedicated leader, a badass pilot, as one friend described her. She logged more than 3,500 hours in 15 types of military aircraft, had a master's in national security strategy from the National War College, and was a staff member for the Joint Chiefs. Throughout her career, she worked to expand opportunities available to Navy women, to fly increasingly sophisticated aircraft, to land on aircraft carriers, to serve at sea, to become test pilots and astronauts, and to serve in squadrons that deployed to combat zones around the world. She was, in the words of author Deborah G. Douglas, arguably the most historically significant woman in American aviation since Amelia Earhart and Jacqueline Cochran. Amelia Earhart, everybody knows. Jacqueline Cochran was one of the founders of the WASP, and at the time of her death in 1980, she held more aviation records than any pilot, man or woman. So those are the 6 women, first women who won Navy Wings of Gold, and these are some of the issues they had to deal with. First off, as we've seen, publicity. From the very beginning of the program, publicity was part of the job. Wherever they were, wherever they went, photographers were always following the women around. The lure of publicity was irresistible to the Navy brass, and it added pressure to women who already had the fate of Zumwalt and Warner's experiments weighing on their shoulders, a burden male flight cadets did not have to bear. These pictures were taken at the Pentagon press conference where John Warner signed Judy Newford's training orders. He even brought out a huge set of wings for the occasion. On that same day, Joellen Dragg took the oath of enlistment. One story covering the event noted that her father had given her a kiss, and it was headlined, "Girl Flyer Gets Kissed, Wants Combat Too." Illustrating it was this picture of Joellen wearing high-heel boots and a miniskirt leaning against the Beech T-34 trainer, which is the military equivalent of the Bonanza. It was captioned, of course, "The shape of things to come." Now, looking at it today, I'm kind of cringing, and Joellen was not really happy that I found this picture. But she totally owns it because it really does speak to the times and to the perceptions that these women had to put up with. Newspaper articles focused on their physical traits, blue-eyed, petite, blonde, brunette with fetching bangs, and looked at their marital status. One reporter wanted to know what the men she dated thought about her flying. The New York Times wrote in January 1973, "There will be no prohibition against their carrying feminine gear such as makeup in the capacious pockets of their flight suits." The writer then helpfully added that a man pilot is allowed to carry personal objects as well. Judy and Barb arrived at Pensacola early, not to get a jump on their flight training, but for PAOs, public affairs opportunities. In the photos at the bottom right, they're standing in the sand wearing high heels and white gloves on the Pensacola obstacle course, in front of a wall that would soon be a literal barrier in their path. When Judy taxied out on her historic first solo, as you saw in the video, all of Softly Field froze in place. Everything came to a standstill until she landed, taxied in, shut down, and shook her skipper's hand. That's a clip from a piece of Judy's logbook with solo written toward the bottom right. And a certificate marking the occasion. Note the pronoun, his first solo flight. Jane is also in the video at the very beginning of the clip, being pushed off a platform into the water and dragged along. That's an exercise called parachute release, and it simulates what happens if a pilot has to ditch in the water and bail out. Eventually, the chute will get waterlogged and pull the pilot under if she can't release the harness. Barb is also in the clip, briefly seen kneeling on the wing of a T-34 holding a fuel cap in her hand. Now, parachute release wasn't the only water training. All student naval aviators had to tread water for 30 minutes and swim a mile in a pool wearing a man-sized flight suit. Some of them were so large the crotch stretched down to the women's knees. One member of a later class who retired as a rear admiral did her swim in a 44 long. There was also something called the Dilbert Dunker, a giant contraption that simulated crash landing in the water. As the student sat inside, it plunged into the pool and then flipped upside down, testing the pilot's ability to escape. There were 1.5-mile runs, ejection seat training, survival training, oxygen deprivation, and explosive decompression to simulate a mid-air catastrophe. For every test, the Navy wanted pictures of the women. Now, everyone hated the Dilbert Dunker, but Judy volunteered to do the Dilbert Dunker photo shoot because she knew the survival training pictures would have a snake, and she didn't want to have to hold the snake. That's Barb holding the snake, and Jane looking on. They cooked the snake and made the women take a bite. Judy said it tasted like chicken. Later, the women went on game shows in uniform. That's Lieutenant Judith Newfer on What's My Line with Larry Blyden. And they were featured in interviews and magazine stories. Judy was on the cover of Parade magazine. And Rosemary was one of Glamour magazine's 10 outstanding working women of 1982. A machine gun, she told the editors, is a great equalizer. Now, even if the women's commanding officers didn't really want them there, they soon realized the value of publicity. Barb and Judy were forced into a race to get their wings because each CO wanted bragging rights to be able to say he had female naval aviator #1. Now, after Rosemary got into fighter jet training, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, she was assigned to an attack squadron in Jacksonville, Florida to learn to fly the A-70 Corsair II. There, the skipper, John McCain, cut her first flight short and had her recalled to the base so reporters could get the story of the lady jet fighter pilot in the next day's papers. That didn't make her happy. She wanted to keep flying. Now, before Jane reported to her first billet and rode to Spain, she had to learn to fly the C-130 Hercules. But the only C-130 school was run by the Air Force. At the time, women in the Air Force didn't fly, and the Air Force really didn't want a Navy woman flying one of their Hercs. But they changed their tune when they realized that Jane was a celebrity, and the press would come running to Little Rock to see the nation's one and only female C-130 pilot taxi out for a check ride. Upper body strength and bathrooms. After Barb and Judy finished up with their days-long photo shoots, the first female naval aviator candidates got down to business. First came 3 days of indoctrination and psychological and physical tests, followed by weeks of intense physical fitness instruction. Every exercise tested mental and physical toughness to prepare future pilots for the risks and potential catastrophes of flying. The women were expected to meet the same standards as men. They all did great in the pool and in survival training, but the walls on the obstacle course were a problem. There were two, one 15 feet high with ropes and the other 8 feet tall that they had to hoist themselves over. The trainees had to run the obstacle course multiple times and finish in a matter of minutes. Even for many men, the walls were a huge challenge, but Jane and Judy had less upper body strength to begin with, and their officer training program emphasized administrative knowledge necessary for supporting a Navy bureaucracy, not physical conditioning needed to serve at sea or in the air. Now, Barb had been a phys ed major, and at least one of the guys in her squadron resented that she could match him sit-up for sit-up. Eventually, they got married. And John and Barb Rainey carved out complementary careers in California, and they raised 2 daughters. Overall, though, the women couldn't meet the men's physical standards, so they got remedial training with pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, bike rowing, and weightlifting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and running on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Eventually, the Navy eliminated the wall requirement for the women and changed some of the other standards. It was probably the only time they let the women proceed when they didn't necessarily meet the requirements, because if they had kept the requirements, the Navy would have lost the entire group. But it was also a test for the Navy, which just assumed that this kind of strength was necessary for pulling a plane out of a spin or dealing with hydraulic failure. The WASP had proven decades before that brute strength wasn't necessary, but that lesson had been forgotten and had to be learned all over again. Now, the civilian recruits who started Women's Officers School about a month before Judy, Barb, and Jane reported to Pensacola knew they were going to need greater arm strength, and they made sure they got that physical training before they started flight school. Jo Ellen said she was particularly fortunate that she had a lot of upper body strength that came from riding horses and shoveling what came out the back end. And that was a skill that served her well. Which brings up the second subject in this section, bathrooms. Somehow, officers in the Navy couldn't deal with the fact, or didn't want to, that women might need a separate place to relieve themselves. and the supposed difficulty of providing separate facilities became a common excuse for disobeying orders and not accommodating women in formerly all-male ships and other facilities. When Jane arrived in Rota, the CO there told her there was only one bathroom, and she wasn't allowed to use it. This is a story about Jane in Stars and Stripes. Her squadron was nicknamed the Go-Go Airline, and of course she was the Go-Go Airline girl. But actually there were two bathrooms. One was marked officers and the other was marked men. So Jane decided that since she was an officer, she should use the one marked officers. And after the first time she walked in on a couple of officers because the stalls didn't have doors on them, the skipper renamed the bathrooms men and women. Motherhood and family. Now, until 1972, pregnancy was cause for immediate dismissal from the military. After that, a woman could request a waiver from her CO, and if he agreed, she could continue her career. So you can imagine the tumult when the woman who was told she wasn't allowed to use the bathroom became America's first pregnant military pilot. Jane's CO assumed she would quit, but she and her husband, a crew chief maintaining the plane she flew, decided that she should stay. She cobbled together civilian clothing into something that looked like a Navy uniform because there were no maternity uniforms. And by the way, there were no maternity flight suits until last summer. Jane caught lots of flack for doing this, even though it was perfectly acceptable under Navy regs. And a man who she described as a very enlightened flight surgeon made a politically risky decision not to ground her until she and he decided it was the right thing to do for her health and for the health of the baby. Jane's male crewmates suggested she name the baby Hercules after the C-130. And one listed the unborn child as a half member of the crew. At 7 months, Jane switched to a desk job, was promoted to lieutenant senior grade 2 weeks after giving birth to a baby girl, and returned to flying about a month later. By the time she got pregnant with her second daughter, she was a flight instructor at Pensacola, and she stopped in her 6th month only because she couldn't reach all the buttons and switches. That baby logged over 100 hours of flight time in 1934. Jane proved it was possible to be a naval aviator, a Navy officer, and a mom all at the same time. Now, juggling two careers wasn't so complicated for Jane and her husband Tom because he was an enlisted man who left the Navy when they returned stateside. But Rosemary Mariner and her husband Tommy were both officers and naval aviators. Usually deciding whose career takes precedence is a major issue when husband and wife were both on active duty. But Tommy realized early on that Rosemary was unique, even though she did not want to be seen as exceptional. And he felt her career should come first. When they retired from the Navy, he held the rank of commander, and she was a captain. Still, he had opportunities she did not. And even as she became the first woman to command an aviation squadron in 1990, she acknowledged that her husband was a window into a world she herself was not allowed to see. This is from her piping on ceremony at BAQ 34, a tactical electronic warfare squadron at Naval Air Station Point Mugu, California. Equal opportunity. One highlight of any naval aviator's career, the thing that made them naval aviators, was carrier qualifying. Landing on a bouncing, shifting, short runway on the deck of an aircraft carrier at full throttle, and then snagging one of 4 arresting cables with the plane's tail hook and being jerked to a stop in 2 seconds flat. Student naval aviators would fly out in groups of 4 to the training carrier Lexington to log their landings, which were called traps. 10 traps, and the aviator was a tail hooker, carrier qualified. It was a huge point of pride, the one thing that distinguished Navy pilots from all others, but the women weren't allowed. And when Lieutenant Judith Newford, Ensign Jane Skiles, and Ensign Rosemary Conitzer wrote a letter asking to be allowed carrier qualification, not only did the Navy say no, but it changed the syllabus to take carrier qualification away from many of the men as well. The Navy said it was a cost-cutting measure, but it was an odd coincidence, and it did not endear the women to the men. In the eyes of many naval aviators, the men, the women were not meeting the same qualifications or sharing the same risks, which the women absolutely agreed with. And some of them felt they did not deserve to be called naval aviators at all. It was only the first of several times in Rosemary's training that she was sent back home early because she wasn't allowed to carrier qualify. It wasn't until 1979, 6 years after this letter, that a female naval aviator was allowed to carrier qualify, and she had to transfer from the West Coast to the East Coast because the Admiral of the Pacific wouldn't let women aboard his ships. And it wasn't until several years after that, after the Lexington became the only carrier to let women serve as crew, that Jane and Rosemary both served on board and finally carrier qualified. Jane said it was the most terrifying thing she's ever done in her life. Now, carrier qualifying was not the only shipboard duty that was off limits to women. Soon after Ensign JoEllen Dragg won her wings and became the Navy's first female helo pilot, she found she wasn't allowed to fly out to ships with the rest of her squadron. Civilian women could go on ships, but she wasn't allowed to fly them there. She couldn't even hover over a ship to deliver the mail. This was because of a law, U.S. Code Title 10, Section 6015, and it said, in part, women shall not be assigned to duty in aircraft while such aircraft are engaged in combat missions. And the Navy interpreted combat mission to mean any vessel that could have a combat mission, not that it was engaged in combat at that time. Now, flying to and from ships was a primary job for Navy helo pilots. JoEllen was being evaluated by the same standards as men for women for work she was not allowed to do. She couldn't log flight time she needed to advance, and the Navy was depriving itself of the services of a qualified pilot trained at tremendous public expense. After her request for permission to fly to ships with her squadron vanished up the chain of command, JoEllen joined a federal class action lawsuit challenging the combat exclusion. And in 1978, Judge John Sirica of Watergate fame ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and mentioned JoEllen specifically by name. The decision wasn't the end of the matter, but it did open the door a bit, allowing Navy women, including JoEllen, to serve shipboard. It was, she said, her salvo in the battle to overturn the combat exclusion, and she became the Navy's first female aviator to perform a shipboard mission. Now, besides confronting restrictions head-on, there were ways around them. For Anna Maria Scott, the Navy's second female helo pilot, it came down to hiding in plain sight. A lieutenant commander in her detachment thought the restrictions made no sense, and he took the risk to give her the experience of landing shipboard. More than once, when landing on an aircraft carrier or destroyer, he took her along as crew. Clandestinely, she had to stay inside the helo with her visor down so no one would know there was a woman on board. Only the two of them, she said, ever knew she had disobeyed the law. Now, another thing the women were not allowed to do, at least at the beginning, was fly jets. Every flight during flight training was graded, from the start of the lesson to shutdown, on everything from flying ability to ground school to situational awareness to head work, how they kept cool under pressure, dealt with distractions, and coped with emergencies. At the end of basic flight training, depending on their grades, the Navy's needs at the time, and to some degree the pilot's wishes, naval aviators were sorted into one of three pipelines: jets, props, or helos. Jets were the sexiest and the most desirable, and only pilots with the best grades got to fly them. But the women got only props or helos, like the less qualified men. Rosemary, for one, would have qualified for jets, but she wasn't allowed. But at her first billet, her commanding officer saw parallels between the obstacles black service members had to deal with in integrating the military and the challenges facing Rosemary and the other female naval aviators. Commander Raymond Lambert was the first black CO at Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia. He became her mentor, a pair of firsts, and he provided a roadmap for how the women should band together, network to protect their careers and each other, and document everything that happened for the record. When Lambert needed more jet pilots, he sent a request for all his junior prop pilots, including her, to do jet transition training. Her orders got lost. But an ex-fighter pilot up the chain of command made sure her orders got found and approved. And in 1976, Rosemary became the first woman to qualify in a fighter jet, the A4EL Skyhawk, though again, she wasn't allowed to qualify with the guys and was sent home early. But by the end of the year, she became the first woman to fly a frontline light attack aircraft, the A-70 Corsair II, at McCain's Squadron in Jacksonville. Here she is in an A-7 with her name on it at VAQ-34 in the 1990s. Wiping over the side. As their careers progressed, the female naval aviators had a platform for making change, not just for themselves, but for the women who followed. In Rosemary's case, watching her husband on his traditional career track gave her insight into what needed to change and how to do it. She was a driving force in the battle in Congress over the combat exclusion in 1991, which was a full court press of military women and their supporters, including the WASP, against opponents in the Senate, including John Warner, John McCain, and John Glenn. Rosemary became a regular guest on TV news programs, op-ed writer, and go-to interviewee for news stories about anything and everything involving women and the military, from sexual harassment to the tailhook scandal to how realistic the film G.I. Jane actually was. Now, Anna Maria had decided, as many men do, that the Navy just wasn't the right fit. So she resigned after her 4.5 years were up. But being a military-trained pilot made her an attractive job candidate, and FedEx hired her, even though she had only helo time, not really fixed wing. She spent her career flying around the country and internationally as a FedEx pilot and eventually retired to France. But the others cycled through high-profile billets, including postings at the Pentagon and command tours, modeling what military women could do. Jane would become commander of a recruiting squadron in Indianapolis, a celebrity in her own right, hanging out with the likes of Chuck Yeager and Al Unser Jr. at the Indy 500. Eventually, she retired, piping over the side in Navy speak in 1997. That's Rosemary at the top with Jane. And if you look at the photo at the bottom, that's the picture it's taken from. This is from Navy Times from the summer of 1997. That's Jane on the left and Rosemary on the right. And again, apologies for the terrible quality of these photos. A lot of them just weren't preserved. And this is all that's left of the record. Rosemary retired a few months after this, and she joined the faculty of the University of Tennessee's Center for the Study of War and Society, specializing in military history and the juncture between war and conscience. She continued to write op-eds, publish articles, and be a commentator and analyst for ABC, NPR, CNN, and other media outlets. Judy had left active duty in 1981 because the P-3 Orion had a combat mission in most squadrons, so her opportunities were limited. So she joined the reserves, where she had more options. She did 3 command tours in the reserves and started working at NASA, first as a computer programmer for the Hubble Space Telescope, and later as Director of Safety and Mission Assurance at the Goddard Space Flight Center. She hadn't done any computer programming in years when she applied, but her contact at NASA had also been a naval aviator, and he figured that if she could do that, she could do this. She retired from the reserves in 1998 after 28 years with the rank of captain, soon after Joe Ellen. The first one in was the last one out. In 2017, Women in Aviation International inducted the first female naval aviators into their Pioneer Hall of Fame. It was the first time they had ever been together as a group, with John Rainey representing his wife, Barb. As the most senior female naval aviator, Judy spoke for the group, and in a tribute video, WAI drew a direct connection between the 6 pioneers and their heroines, the WASP. 1,000 people stood up and cheered, among them some active duty female naval aviators, including combat veterans, who 2 years later, after Rosemary passed away of cancer, would fly the Navy's first ever all-female missing man flyover at her funeral. Some had met her and all knew her story and the debt they owed to the original female naval aviators. And this past March, Rosemary Mariner was re-inducted into the WAI Hall of Fame as an individual honoree. Now, these are the flyover pilots. This picture's on the back cover of the book. And these are all F-18 pilots. And the pilot on the bottom right, Lieutenant Amanda Lee, 2 months ago was named the first woman demonstration pilot for the Blue Angels. And she'll be making her debut in California in March. And Joellen and Mary Louise Griffin, who was in the second group of women, they're planning a big show coming out. I'm told I'm going. That'll be a show. Well, these pictures were taken at the funeral. That's Joellen all the way at the right, and Judy standing next to her, and then 2 over is Mary Louise Griffin. She was the second female jet pilot, and she's a centerpiece of the female naval aviator community. And I have to give her all the props in the world, because I couldn't have written this book or even found all these women without her help. She was just a tremendous, tremendous resource. And at the hotel, after the funeral, several generations of female naval aviators honoring one of their own. Now, I have one more video we'll show in a second, but those are my These are some of my talking points, where the book can be found. Oh, did I skip one? Oh, it's not there. Okay. So that's where the book can be found. That's my website, and I guess if we can switch to the last video, it's talking to the flyover pilots about that experience and what it meant to them.
Can you read that for us?
Can you read it aloud for people?
Sure. Sure. Do you want to run it back?
Yes.
Okay. Sure. 8 naval aviators flew an all-female flyover to honor the Navy's first female jet pilot, Captain Rosemary Mariner, on February 2nd. The NAS Oceana-based aviators overflew Mariner's Tennessee funeral in the first ever missing woman formation.
There was an email that went out from the second female jet pilot. Her name's Captain Retired Mary Louise Griffin, and she was kind enough to let us all know of Captain Mariner's passing last Friday. The flyover idea came shortly after that from a group of incredible retired women aviators who had quite a few contacts, made some calls, and I think by Monday the planning was well in the works. One of the neatest things about this flyover is that of all of us sitting here today, we would not be sitting here were it not for some of the work that she did. As well, we have 2 Top Gun graduates, we've got a commanding officer, an executive officer, and combat veterans sitting here. We would not be here today without her, and none of us are first. She was a first, the first female jet pilot and the first commanding officer. The fact that none of us are first is really a testament to her.
I can remember in 1993, I was 15 years old, and that's when the combat exclusion was lifted, so women could fly in combat in 1993. I did not know who was behind it. I didn't know what women had been fighting for that, and I had no idea how big of an impact that policy decision was until, honestly, we put this crew together, and I was looking at all our bios, and I saw how many combat deployments we had under our belt as a group, and it was pretty awe-inspiring to think back to 26 years ago in April, the decision that was made to allow us to do what we've done now.
Flying today's weapon systems is a continuous process of study. It takes approximately 3 years to get through flight school, and the hard work doesn't stop there, but through hard work and perseverance, you can really achieve any dream. That's the door that Captain Mariner opened for us, so never think because you're a girl, you can't do something.
We embody the work that she did because we're here and we're able to fly these aircraft together in division in tribute to her and her service and the actions that she had to undertake in order to enable us to be here. And that's where our focus really lies.
We obviously want to make it look good for Captain Mariner, and in her honor is sort of her last flight and the last testament that we can honor. We have to honor her, as all 8 combat aviators that are going to be in this flyover. It truly is kind of the last measure of what her legacy has left for us.
Okay, so we can either go to Q&A or I have a short excerpt that I can read.
Yeah.
So either way. Okay, why don't I read a little piece of chapter 7 and then I guess we can
that'll be good.
You can take questions? Okay, so chapter 7, Owens v. Brown. For 2 glorious days in 1974, Interior Communications electrician second class Yona Owens was a full-fledged member of the crew of the survey ship USNS Michelson. No men in her specialty were available, and orders approving her for sea duty on the non-combat vessel were signed and sealed, until they were rescinded by the Judge Advocate General as a violation of federal law. Under Section 6015, Navy women were not allowed to serve on ships, though civilian scientists and technicians and Army and Air Force women were all allowed to travel and work on board. Frustrated at the restrictions that stymied her career, Owens had begun networking. A letter she published in Navy Times offering to share research on women's rights yielded 312 requests for help. Yeoman Suzanne Holtzman was a staffer in a new personnel office for enlisted women. The two connected, and with two other enlisted women, aided by the American Civil Liberties Union and the League of Women Voters Educational Fund, they decided to file a class action lawsuit against the federal government, charging discrimination on behalf of 21,870 Navy women. The defendants, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown and Secretary of the Navy W. Graham Claytor. At the same time, Lieutenant Joellen Dragg was chafing under the limits Section 6015 placed on her ability to do her job. She wasn't allowed to hover her helicopter over a ship. Civilian women could go on ships, but she couldn't fly them there. There were always mechanical problems with the blades on the CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter, so much of the fleet was grounded frequently. This made it difficult for her to log hours and meet other qualifications to advance, even in shore-based billets. Joellen wasn't the only officer at San Diego who thought it was time to bring the rules up to date. While she was pursuing administrative remedies and writing letters up the chain of command, others were also questioning why Section 6015 still existed. Among these was Lieutenant Suzanne Riddle-Hoover, who was studying at night to become a lawyer. Also, Lieutenant Commander Kathleen Byerly, a women's officer school graduate, and coincidentally, one of Time Magazine's 12 Women of the Year in January 1976, along with former First Lady Betty Ford and tennis superstar Billie Jean King. The three officers asked Riddle-Hoover's constitutional law professor for help, and in researching Section 6015, they discovered the class action suit already in the works. With her previous requests denied and her career stalling, Joellen sent one more letter, assisted by the Judge Advocate General's attorney in her wing, and endorsed by her commanding officer. The letter went up the chain of command and vanished. Joellen suspects that one of the Navy brass was dead set against the idea of female military pilots, and that another, scarred by his experiences in Vietnam, couldn't square those horrific memories with the idea of women as prisoners of war. So the three female officers joined the four enlisted women in pursuing the only remaining course of action, a judicial appeal. Joellen didn't have to testify, and life went on as usual. Most of the men in her squadron weren't even aware there was a lawsuit, let alone that she was a named plaintiff. But on July 27, 1978, Judge John Sirica ruled Section 6015 unconstitutional, and his opinion addressed Joellen specifically by name. The Navy saw there was no argument left and declined to appeal. 3 months later, the Defense Authorization Bill amended Section 6015, leaving severe limitations in place, but it redefined the role of female aviators and allowed them for the first time to land on ships. For the first time in Joellen Dragg's career and in Navy history, a female helo pilot would be assigned aboard a Navy ship. That ship was the Vancouver, and the assignment was a 6-day military exercise 300 miles off the California coast. Flying out and landing, the only woman within miles, Joellen was tasked with retrieving remote-controlled drones launched from ships in the exercise. Measuring 8 to 10 feet long and looking like miniature orange airplanes, the drones simulated enemy aircraft for ships and planes to shoot at. Eventually, they would ditch in the ocean, and the helos would fly over to retrieve them one at a time. A crew member sitting in a doorway, dangling 10 feet above the ocean, would snag the drone with a long pole and then attach it to a cargo hook in the floor. There were dangers. If the drone was at the wrong angle of attack, it could start flying on its own underneath the helo and cause serious damage. A chopper that hovered too low could suck ocean water spray into the engine intakes, collect salt on the turbines, and stall. That's what happened to the second helo in the exercise. The crew couldn't restart the engine and the chopper flipped over in the sea. Joellen flew over to rescue the second helo's 5 crew members and return them to a ship. After recovering the rest of the targets and landing again, she wandered towards sickbay to see if the other crew was all right. Suddenly, a sailor jumped out, saluted, and said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am." The sailors had been on the signal bridge when the helo went in the water, and they'd all bet that she was the pilot who'd been flying. They let the woman touch the controls, and she crashed. For the next 3 or 4 days, with the second helo crew grounded until the accident investigation was over, she and the other remaining male pilot had to do all the flying. More than once, hovering near the ship, she caught sailors taking pictures of the lady helo pilot recovering targets.
Yeah, so I can move the wireless mic for anybody that has questions. There, okay. Anybody have any questions?
I just wondered, do you know how many female aviators are in service now?
I don't. I should. I mean, at this point, I think the overall number from the start of the program is in the hundreds, but the percentage is still
So
extremely,
small, yeah.
extremely low. I think it's less than 5%.
Oh, this way.
The gentleman behind you said, ladies first. Thank you. Were there, when they had the same rank, was their pay the same and their benefits the same?
The benefits were the same. The pay, I believe so, although there were differences until the combat restrictions were all lifted, because there were extra credit for being in hazardous situations with the women were not allowed. The men would rotate between sea duty and shore duty. The women were restricted to shore duty, and there were some machinations to try to equalize it somehow, but it really didn't work.
Congratulations on your Pulitzer and
thank
the
you.
book.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. So in preparation when you're interviewing the various aviators, how many of these heroes did you get? I know you mentioned one. How many hours did you get with them overall, would you guess?
So it was a combination of phone calls, emails, and a little bit in person. I had just finished booking a fair amount of travel when the pandemic hit. So pretty much everything shut down. I had managed to meet in person with 2 of the women before that, and I was able to meet with another one the summer before last, but Anne Maria Scott is in France. So that was, I think, 1 phone call and emails. And I didn't meet Joellen in person until the Women in Aviation Conference this past March. I mean, I was really fortunate that so much had been written about them at the time that there was just this huge archive of coverage of what they had done. So the basic research into the story had been done for me. It was just a question of finding them and then talking to the women, talking to their families, talking to people who had served with them, and put the meat on the bones of the story, and then figure out what was going on in the country more broadly, what was happening in the military at the time, what changes they were reacting to, what changes they were able to put into place, and finding personal stories that illustrated those changes that were going on. And they were all very, very generous with their time. And I was blown away. They didn't have to talk to me at all. And some of them knew they had an incredible story. It had saved every piece of paper, every piece of memorabilia, and I thought they might write a book someday, and then really didn't know what they were going to do with it. And then the stranger comes along and says, I want to write your life story. And they said, okay.
One more question over here. Get my steps.
To put this in context, what did women aviators do in World War II?
The WASP basically did everything but fly in combat. They were flight instructors, they were ferry pilots, they were demonstration pilots. There were some bombers that men were afraid to fly because they were so squirrely. So, but let's put the woman in it. If a woman could fly it, how hard could it really be? They towed targets for gunners to shoot at with live ammo. everything stateside that could possibly have been done, and they flew every military plane the United States produced.
So between the WASPs and these 6 ladies, was there no other service having any women pilots or
Nope.
any kind of interest?
Nope.
So for 30-plus years, nothing happened?
Right, so the WASP, when the program was disbanded, it was basically classified and buried, and the women's service records were buried. And they were sent home, no record, no recognition, and in 1948, federal law was changed to forbid women, basically. Those restrictions I listed at the beginning, they couldn't be a commanding officer over men. There were only a very limited number of women who were allowed to attain the rank of captain, and just basically limiting them to desk jobs. There were to be no women on ships. I think Carl Vinson said, just fix it so they can't go to sea at all, and they did.
Question over here, I saw some.
Once this barrier was broken for the Navy, what followed for the other branches that had aviation?
The Air Force followed pretty closely behind. The Navy, kind of got the ball rolling. The Air Force jumped in, and for what it was worth, the Air Force was much better at publicity than the admiral who was in charge of the Navy when the combat restriction was lifted. So all the focus has been on the Air Force just because they were able to grab the spotlight and hang on to it. The Army has, I think, mostly helo pilots, but there are relatively large numbers of women in those billets. And the Coast Guard, I believe, also has a cadre of female helo pilots also. And of course, the Air Force put women in their demonstration team in the 1990s. So yes, we have the first female Blue Angel, but it took them so long. That's what the women in my book want to know.
We have a question right over here. Yep.
So started in the United States where the ladies finally were able to fly. Do you know if they were flying any place else around the world before here?
Russia.
Well, I mean, Russia had female fighter pilots in World War II. They called them the Night Witches because they flew these old rickety planes and they would just swoop in and scare the hell out of the Germans. I don't know what other military services in other countries. I'm assuming there must have been some. I mean, probably in some of the countries that are beyond where the United States was, even in terms of female civilian pilots, airline pilots.
Thanks very much.
Any other questions?
You said you were a pilot?
I am.
What do you fly?
I have a Piper Archer, 1977. Had it for about a year and a half. Sweet little airplane.
You didn't join the Navy?
I didn't join the Navy. I kind of floated the idea when I was 13, and my mother was having none of it.
I think we have one final question over here.
Either after they got out of the military or while they were still in, how active were these women in promoting non-military women's flight? Did they join the 99s? Did they help run search and rescue? How were they participating, I guess?
One of the things that I found surprising was that after they left the service, none of them continued to fly. It was a job, it was over, that was it. But I know that when they were in the reserves, a few of them did join the 99s. Jane O'Day was a member of the DC 99s for a while. I think Joe Ellen and Rosemary were 99s for a bit. The two of them flew the Air Race Classic once. I think it was still called the Powder Puff Derby at the time. In 73 or 74, the Navy put up a team. They did okay. I think it actually ended in Michigan, and what Joe Ellen told me is that when they had been told to look for a ski lift. They're from California. They were picturing some big thing. They flew past it 4 or 5 times trying to not know what they were looking at.
know if we have any other.
Well, thank you very much, Mary.
Well, thank you so much.
One little side note I'd like to add. I recall it's just been within the past few years that the WASP pilots have gained authorization to be buried at Arlington and any other military cemetery. It's a travesty.
Long time coming.
Long time. I want to thank Beverly for an amazing program. We have great programs like this first Wednesday of every month. Next month, December 7th, we'll welcome Mr. Jack Weber, who will talk about the Navy WV-2s in World War II, better known as Willie Victors. We just happen to have one. Known as the EC-121. Civilian version was the Lockheed Constellation. Please remember the donation boxes off to the side and just outside the door are hungry. $5 donation will make them happy. Your support truly does go a long way. Thank you again, Becca, for an amazing program. As always, thank you all for coming out tonight. Until next month, bye-bye and bye-bye. See you.